somewhat by fits and starts, but actually a pretty steady transition towards both more open government and more decentralized government. And that has created a fair amount of openings for NGOs. And as you'll see from some of my examples, one of the arenas that they've been working with government on is changes in legal and administrative procedures. Socioeconomic dynamics, this is an interesting one, I find, in that many of the organizations that DRSP worked with were outgrowths of the student uprisings that promoted the departure of Suharto. So it's a generation that emerged. They had either were just graduating from university or had been out for a little bit. And so there's a cohort of leaders that are all about the same age. They all emerged from this same experience base, and then they all decided to form NGOs. So one of the things that is discussed in some of the Indonesian literature around the democracy promoting groups and all is the fact that they're referred to as floating democrats, and what that means is that they are from essentially an urban elite, and they have very few ties to a broad base of Indonesian society, and their main relations are with the donor funders of democracy programs. So they know a lot more about how the Asia Foundation works than they know about what goes on in municipal cities throughout Indonesia. They also tend to be very focused on big urban areas, so heavily focused in Jakarta and some of the other big cities. So the connection to the rest of the country and constituencies that they might access is relatively limited. So that's a quick overview of some of the external ones. Internal ones, I think, for those of you working on the Transnational NGO Initiative, these are familiar things from the research that you're focusing on. So obviously the vision and mission of these organizations makes a difference. As I said, many of them emerged out of the protest movement, and they began to look around and decide what areas they were going to focus on. Obviously, elections were one, so there's a relatively well-known organization called the Center for Electoral Reform. Another group, many of the protesters were lawyers. So there's a Center for Law and Policy Studies that was put together, a Civil Society Alliance for Democracy. And so all of them sort of crafted their missions around this democratic transition. And the leadership structure tends to be a founding president or director surrounded by a small group of followers. And so when you talk about management structures, very flat organizations, you know, the leader on top and then some other people underneath, and then maybe one more layer below that, but often not too much more than that. Procedures, pretty much seat of the pants. One of the drives for formalization has come with the strings attached to the funding. So grant reporting requirements have driven a lot of them to create financial systems, and DRSP worked with a lot of the NGOs to help them do that kind of activity. So putting in place management and accounting systems, putting in place target setting, so coming up with work plans, all those kinds of things were important. And then, of course, resources. As I mentioned, most of the resources for these organizations have come from the outside. Some small contributions now from corporate social responsibility. A few of them have been successful at tapping Indonesian multinational corporations. Indonesia has a relatively well-developed economy that has big corporations, some of whom have an interest in CSR. And so one of the other issues then is you know, given that funding base, and their relations mainly with their donors, is stakeholder relations is becoming a major issue for these organizations in terms of who in fact are their constituencies in Indonesia. And there's been a rising criticism of NGOs in a lot of the issues that you all focus on, things like, who are they accountable to, how well are they performing? Because one of the difficulties that has happened, is often the case, is that as donor priorities shift and as funding sources diminish on one side and expand on the others, apart from whatever the mission statement is, you find organizations chasing the money. So even if your focus is on electoral reform, you may get a grant for some kind of other activity. And so this has been part of the performance issue, is the old problem of promising a lot and trying to be all things to all people, and not doing so well on that. In terms of products, for democracy promotion, one of the interesting things that we worked with these organizations on is, I'd say when they started out, the product line for most of them was one thing. It was advocacy by protest in the streets. And whenever they identified an issue, they said, well, we'll mobilize, we'll have a demonstration, we'll go yell at the government, we'll try to get the press to come. And as the transition moved away from simply opposing what had been before to changing and modifying, NGOs were put in the position of trying to be partners with government. And in some cases that was kind of difficult, because one, having spent their time yelling at government, they then went to them and said, now we want to help you. As you can imagine, they weren't always welcomed with open arms. In fact, in many cases they were told to go away. And so the whole trust issue on both sides is the NGO folks tended to see the government people as venal, corrupt, stupid, entrenched and unresponsive, and the government from their side saw the NGOs as basically troublemakers, and didn't really want to have too much to do with them. So one of the big capacity issues that we helped to work with them on was, from sort of a business perspective, is saying, let's think about expanding your product line. Let's move beyond just doing protests. And in fact, a lot of the partnership work that they got involved in had to do with marshaling technical expertise, becoming channels for information that government wanted from different levels of society, and building up their capacity to provide the kinds of things that their government partners were interested in from them. And one of the other ways that they did this was by not just working as a single NGO, but by coming together in networks of NGOs to address particular policy issues. So performance has improved to some extent. They do still have some difficulties, and we'll get into that. So let's talk about a few examples. The first one, these are the Indonesian acronyms, so when I tell you what it stands for, don't look for it to match the letters. The first one, that's the Forum for Popular Participation. It was founded in 2001 with 40 CSOs with seed money from the Ford Foundation. And we in DRSP worked with them on helping. They had gotten an invitation from the Ministry of Home Affairs, which is an extremely powerful ministry in Indonesia. And they were working on a guideline for regional planning. And there they wanted to, the ministry was interested in having some kind of technical input on drafting this particular law, and the Forum for Popular Participation thought that this was a good arena for them to interact in. And as I mentioned, the opening for this came because of the personal commitment of a bureaucrat within the Ministry of Home Affairs to engage with civil society. And so this was an experience that worked out relatively well, and the NGO input was welcomed. They demonstrated their technical expertise, and as a result of that, they became much more trusted. There were still people who didn't really trust them that much, but particularly when over time the relationship built up to where they were invited to meetings and to drafting sessions for the law, which generally were closed before, that you would not have civil society input to putting the laws together. The next one there, FPBD is the Forum for Village Renewal. Here, this was a different directorate in the ministry, but they were looking for some input on the formulation of a law on villages, which was a piece of the larger decentralization push in Indonesia. Here again, this FPPD was actually a spin-off from FPPM. It was a subgroup of the 40 who were interested in local level village participation. So it was a smaller group that was involved, about a dozen or so. And in this case, it wasn't as happy a situation as before. One of the issues that came up was that the forum, being composed of a number of NGOs, not everybody agreed on what they should be doing in relation to the government. Some of them were very strong on their perspective that the village law should provide full autonomy to local level and essentially delink it from the rest of government. And then there were other members who said, no, well, we need to be seen by the government as willing to engage in the level at which they're interested in, which was within this, as I said, decentralization legal framework. So there was quite a bit of internal dispute until they finally agreed that they couldn't just stand on their principles and tell the ministry, you either take what we want to say or nothing, which was sort of the old advocacy perspective. So they did end up putting together a working group that worked closely with this particular group on coming up with this legislation. But again, the head of the directorate at that piece of the ministry never quite trusted the NGOs the way the other person did. And so when it came down to drafting the actual law, that's when the government closed the door on the NGOs and said, thank you very much for your input, we'll take it from here. So there were, within the forum, they then started to have discussions among themselves and recriminations and, oh, we should have pushed harder, and those kinds of issues came up. The third example is from the city of Madiun, where there was a loose civil society coalition of about 25 NGOs that were invited. Well, they set themselves up to try to influence the municipal government around budget transparency and local spending, and they got their start in terms of organizing and working with the government when the government essentially handed them a municipal development plan and said, here guys, take a look at this and sign off on it for us, please. And they said, wait a minute, no. They said, the law on participation, which had been passed at that time, says you have to have stakeholder consultation before you can do these things. And so the local government said, well, okay. And so this coalition began to organize these kinds of forums to review the contents of the municipal planning document. And they found their best allies were in the local parliaments, which again was a creation of the decentralization. There had never been local parliaments before. And so they connected up with some of the reformist members in the parliament who were interested in pushing for more engagement and more transparency and openness. So again, this is a more relatively successful example where they did end up getting the plan reviewed much more broadly, getting agreement from government